following sermon was delivered at the 10:30 worship service at the United Methodist Church of Kent. Please enjoy.
Do you know who you are? I mean, really, inside, who you are. Do you know whose you are? And do you know the way you want to live? Questions like those cut to the core of our identity and our purpose, and they are questions well worth revisiting, reconsidering, re-choosing from time to time over the course of our lives. Do you know who you are? Do you know whose you are? Do you know the way you want to live? There are also the questions being faced, whether addressed or avoided, by Jesus and the disciples in today's gospel. Our gospel today is part of a pivotal section in Mark's gospel that begins Jesus' movement toward the cross, quite deliberately, quite directly toward the cross, toward his final confrontation there with the powers that be and his example, ultimate example of self-giving love. At the end of chapter 8, the chapter just prior to today's reading, Jesus had asked the disciples then, sort of a check-in question, who do people say that I am? After they offer a few different suggestions, John the Baptist, Elijah, maybe one of the other prophets, Jesus turns the question more directly to them. What about you? He asks them. Who do you say that I am? You are the Christ, the Messiah, Peter responds. You are God's anointed. And immediately Jesus starts explaining what a Christ, a Messiah, an anointed one is, for his explanation is quite different from their expectations. You see, at that time, and truth be told at our time too, cultural expectations were mostly about military power and grand displays of power as strength, specifically power over, power against. The Christ, the Messiah, the anointed one of God, was expected to demonstrate God's power in this world through any and all of these traditional means, through violence, through domination, through control. And yet that wasn't how Jesus ever lived his identity. That wasn't how Jesus ever demonstrated power. He didn't go to war with the powers that be in any of those traditional ways. Instead, he went to folks. All sorts of folks from different places and different backgrounds, different needs, different abilities. He spoke with folks that he went to. He asked them what they desired and listened for their response. He touched folks, he healed folks, he fed folks and ate with them. He demonstrated power not over or against, but through compassion. That's how it always had been with Jesus. That's who he was, that's who he is still. From the very beginning, Jesus chose to be God's word made flesh. Not just a word of love spoken from above somewhere, but a word of love spoken up close and personal. Christ, though in the image of God, we read in Philippians 2, did not deem equality with God as something to be clung to or held on to or exploited, but instead became completely empty and took on the image of oppressed humankind. Christ demonstrated power not as the power to control, but as the power to be with. Power through compassion, power through solidarity. Christ chose to be Emmanuel, chose to be God with us, not God over or God against us, but God with us, to show us what it looks like, to show us where it can lead, to show us the freedom and the abundance of living contrary to our position and our privilege. In the very first chapter of Mark's gospel, as we're getting to know who this Jesus is, at the moment of his baptism, Jesus hears a voice speaking from heaven. You are my child, the voice says, whom I dearly love. The same voice is heard again at the beginning of chapter 9, this chapter we read from today, just before today's story begins, at the moment of Jesus' transfiguration. And again the voice says, this is my child, whom I dearly love. That voice tells Jesus, that voice reminds Jesus who he is. And knowing who he is, he's then able to live like it, And he tries repeatedly then to share who he is with his disciples, with those who want to follow him. Because following him means sharing his identity. Following him means that who he is, we are too. The very same voice that spoke to Jesus in his baptism and again at his transfiguration speaks to us all throughout our lives. You are my child, whom I dearly love. Do you know that that's who you are? Do you know that that's whose you are? Do you know that you're God's beloved child? And do you know what that means then for the way that you can live? Do you know what that can look like and where it can lead you, the freedom, the abundance of living contrary to our position and our privilege? Like Christ, with Christ, choosing as we can to be with each other instead of over and against each other. Sharing Christ's identity, living the truth of who and whose we are means being disruptors of the status quo. It means stepping out of and even actively resisting this hierarchical system of constantly competing and striving and trying to get out ahead. When we say that we are followers of Christ, we proclaim that we won't be subject to those traditional and typical rules of engagement. We won't participate in that violence. We won't participate in those endless competitions with our neighbors. There are choices we must make after we choose to follow Christ. Choices we must make day after day that serve as markers of who and of whose we are. So which way will we choose? Will we find ways to feed our neighbors who are hungry? Or will we instead protect our own seat at the table? Will we seek ways to walk with neighbors who are vulnerable or marginalized, ignored, and overlooked? Or will we center ourselves in every conversation? Will we, like the first disciples, expend our focus and energy arguing about who's the greatest among us? Or will we give our time and energy to speaking words of encouragement, including for those with whom we disagree? So far as I can recall, Jesus never in any of his stories flashed credentials to confirm his identity. Instead, he lived it simply. He lived it radically, and he lived it consistently through compassion and companionship and collaboration. So I wonder, what might we do this week? What might we do this month to help us more closely resemble the identity of the one who came to welcome those we often ignore? It is, after all, Jesus' welcome that serves as the climax of today's story. Having overheard the disciples arguing about which of them is the greatest, he doesn't address their question directly as they might have expected him to do, but instead he demonstrates, once again, the power of being with. We're not told whose house they've entered in Capernaum that day, just that there's a child there. We don't know whose child it is even, but Jesus reaches for that child, places the child in the center of the conversation, and embraces them. And as he does so consistently, Jesus brings this one so often and so easily overlooked, into the center of our field of vision. Jesus reaches out for the child, likely the most vulnerable person in the house that day, and embraces the child. Jesus creates a safe space for that child among this gathering of very important or self-important adults. And then he tells those who would follow him that whoever wants to be first must be the servant of all. Imagine for a moment the tension in the room as Jesus spoke those words. Imagine, too, how others might have received those words, not just the disciples, those who had been jockeying for position, but imagine the actual servants in the room that day, or maybe other children in the room that day, maybe even others, invisible, marginalized ones, unmentioned by the writer of the gospel. What might those folks have felt when they heard Jesus say, "Whoever wants to be first must be the servant of all"? Well, the disciples might have thought that they were exceptional because they'd been chosen, they'd been called, they'd been invited to follow this traveling teacher and healer. Now he makes it plain that it is not their proximity to him that counts, but it is their willingness to come near to others. Whoever welcomes a child welcomes me, Jesus says, and whoever welcomes me welcomes God. This is what it means to live our identity, who and whose we are as God's beloved children. It's a way of living that makes room for everyone and does so by giving special, extra consideration to those who've been overlooked and ignored and excluded. And so the question is then, and it is a question, for none of this is ever forced upon us. It's an invitation. The question is, do we want to live this way? Will we live our identity as God's beloved children or not? Will we live lives that transcend the sources of conflict among us, choosing to embrace the power God gives us to be with each other instead of over and against? Will we live such lives even knowing that we'll be swimming upstream as we do so? And will we sacrifice our own position and privilege to become servants of all? Or, on the other hand, will we keep living as though life is some endless competition, a zero-sum game in which some win and others must lose? Will we keep living as though life is a big game of king of the mountain, scrambling to the top, clinging to the top, lashing out when our position feels like it's threatened, and kicking at others down below? Or will we live life as a journey, a gracious journey, filled with surprising and wonderful companions along the way? Life as an opportunity to welcome children, to serve neighbors, to extend our reach, to ensure that all God's children everywhere know just how tremendously, how unconditionally, how unendingly they are loved. Do you know? Do you know which way you want to live? That day in Capernaum, in that house, whatever house Jesus entered, I like to imagine Jesus embracing that little child. And after giving that lesson in servanthood while the disciples are scratching their heads, still trying to figure this thing out, I imagine Jesus bending low to bring those words from heaven down to earth again. The same words spoken to Jesus at his baptism, the same words spoken again at his transfiguration, those same words now spoken to this unnamed, fragile, overlooked child. You are God's child, and you are dearly loved. Can you imagine Jesus whispering those words this morning into that child's ear, into your ear too? You are God's child, and you are dearly loved. Can you hear those words spoken to you as a reminder, as an assurance of who and whose you are, and as God's call on your life to live that same love into the lives of others? You are God's child. You are dearly loved, just exactly as you are. For that, thanks be to God. Amen.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the United Methodist Church of Kent Sermon Podcast. For more information about the church, visit www.kentmethodist.org.